The war was over. That's what they said. Commander Elias Voss knew better. He had spent too many years chasing ghosts across the fringes of known space to believe in peace. The Corthan Dominion had retreated, licking its wounds after humanity's costly victory. But the embers of war still burned in the shadows. He had seen it firsthand. The scattered incursions, the whispered warnings from dying soldiers, the silent ships that vanished beyond the dark. The Galactic Council could sign all the treaties it wanted, but Voss understood the truth. The war had never ended. It had only changed. Now, standing in the steel belly of the Erebus, a decommissioned warship held together more by desperation than engineering, Voss listened to the voice on the other end of the transmission. It was strained, barely holding together, distorted by ion interference. But he knew that voice. "They're coming back, Voss," Eric Dorn said. The man had once been his second-in-command, a soldier who had fought with a reckless fury that made him both invaluable and dangerous. Now he sounded tired. "This isn't like before. They're not probing defenses anymore. They're preparing for something bigger." Voss exhaled slowly, watching the dim lights flicker along the edges of the bridge. "Do you have proof?" A pause. A name. Project Reclamation. The word sent a cold weight settling in his chest. He had heard whispers of it in intercepted transmissions, buried in classified reports. It was never more than a rumor, a ghost of a threat that the bureaucrats in the council dismissed. But if Dorn was saying it out loud, then it was real. "I need your help, Voss." The connection cut out. Voss stared at the dark console for a long moment before pushing away from the controls. His boots echoed against the grated floor as he left the bridge, moving through the dim corridors of the Erebus. The ship wasn't much, but it had been home since he walked away from the military. Not that he had ever truly left. He found Leora Kane in the engine bay, her arms buried elbow-deep in a tangled mess of wiring. She was cursing softly, forehead creased in concentration as she worked a set of pliers into an exposed conduit. "We're running out of time," Voss said. She didn't look up. "You're always running out of time? This is different." That made her pause. With a sigh, she withdrew her hands and turned, brushing a strand of auburn hair from her face. "Tell me." He did. He kept it short. Dorn's warning, the name Project Reclamation, the unspoken certainty that they were standing at the edge of something much worse than the last war. Kane listened in silence, arms crossed, her sharp green eyes unreadable. When he finished, she let out a breath and shook her head. "You always find a way to drag me back into hell, don't you?" "You always say yes," Voss replied. She gave him a dry look, but didn't argue. The next call was Marielton. Voss had to route the connection through 3 separate relays, each one more illegal than the last, before he found her. "Voss," she said, her voice laced with amusement. "It's been a while. Did you finally decide to join the rest of us criminals?" "Not yet." "Shame." Mara was an expert in systems infiltration, which was a polite way of saying she could tear apart any security network she touched. She had spent the war turning enemy systems against them, and when the fighting stopped, she hadn't bothered switching careers. Voss didn't waste time. "I need intel on something called Project Reclamation." There was a pause. Then, softer. "Where did you hear that?" "That bad? That classified?" He waited. She sighed. "I'll look into it." No promises. The connection cut, and Voss turned back to Kane. She was already packing her gear. The last call was the hardest. He hesitated outside the comm room, staring at the blinking light of an encrypted channel. It had been 3 years since he last spoke to Dorn. 3 years since their last mission ended in blood and betrayal. Voss keyed the transmission. It was accepted immediately. "I didn't think you'd answer," he admitted. Dorn's voice was steady. "You were never good at staying dead." Neither of them said what they really meant. "I'm on Perseus Station," Dorn continued. "Docking Bay 17. If you're coming, come fast. I don't know how long I have." The line went dead. Voss turned to Kane. Ready? She gave him a grim smile. We were never going to stay out of this, were we? No. She nodded, sealing her bag. In the end, they both knew the truth. The war had never ended. And neither had they. Perseus Station hung against the void, a dying star wrapped in steel. The outer hull was pitted with age, its docking arms sagging under the weight of ships that should have been scrapped long ago. The kind of place where war never really stopped, only shifted faces. Voss guided the Erebus into the docking bay, the magnetic clamps locking into place with a groan. Kane was already unstrapping herself from the co-pilot seat, eyes scanning the station through the viewport. This place is a graveyard, she muttered. Voss keyed in the airlock sequence. That's why Dorn is here. They stepped onto the station with practiced wariness. The air smelled of stale coolant and unwashed bodies. Vendors lined the walkway, selling everything from black market weapon mods to rations barely fit for consumption. The people here, mercenaries, deserters, smugglers, moved with the cautious ease of those who had learned that survival was a privilege, not a right. Dorn was waiting near a rusting cargo loader, arms crossed over a battered chest plate. He hadn't changed much, still the same broad shoulders, the same scar that cut from his jaw to his temple. But his eyes were older, heavier. You're late, he said. Voss stopped a few feet away, keeping his hands loose at his sides. I don't like rushing into ambushes. Dorn huffed a dry laugh. If I wanted you dead, I'd have let the Corthans handle it. Kane stepped forward. Let's skip the posturing. What the hell is Project Reclamation? Dorn exhaled, glancing around before jerking his head toward the back of the docking bay. Not here. They followed him through a maze of corridors until they reached a storage unit reinforced with old military plating. Inside, dim lights flickered over a table littered with stolen data cores and half-scrubbed transmission logs. Dorn tapped a console, and a holographic map flickered to life above the table. This, he said, pointing to a cluster of red mark systems, is where they're rebuilding. Voss studied the map. The systems were scattered, nothing tying them together at first glance. But the longer he looked, the more it felt deliberate, like puzzle pieces waiting to be placed. How do you know? Dorn pulled a small drive from his belt and tossed it onto the table. Intercepted comm logs. Movements. Supply routes. They never stopped, Voss. They just got better at hiding. Kane picked up the drive, turning it over between her fingers. And Project Reclamation? Dorn hesitated. They're calling it a return to Dominion. Not just retaliation erasure. They're preparing something big, something that makes the last war look like a border skirmish. A slow, cold realization settled in Voss's gut. The Corthans weren't just planning to attack. They were planning to end humanity. A sharp beep cut through the silence. Voss spun toward the door, pulse spiking. Dorn moved fast, slamming a hand against the wall. A hidden panel slid open, revealing a weapons rack. He tossed Kane a pistol, grabbed a rifle for himself. Tracked, he muttered. I was careful, but I should have known. The first explosion ripped through the wall. Metal shrieked as the impact threw them sideways. Voss hit the ground hard, rolling behind the table as a second blast tore the door apart. Dust and fire filled the air, shadows moving in the smoke. Corthan hunters. They came in fast, tall, sinewy figures clad in dark armor, their plasma rifles humming with lethal intent. Dorn fired first, his rifle barking in rapid succession. One of the Corthans crumpled, its armor splitting under the barrage. Kane took down another with a clean shot to the throat. Voss surged forward, grabbing a fallen weapon, his instincts kicking in like they always did. War had carved them into his bones. He fired into the chaos, every shot precise, measured. The Corthans were good, but they weren't ready for soldiers who had never stopped fighting. The last one tried to retreat, slipping back into the smoke. Voss caught him at the door, driving his rifle, but into the alien skull. The body dropped, twitching. Silence settled. thick with burned ozone and the stink of blood. Kane wiped a smear of dust from her cheek. Subtle. Dorn kicked over one of the bodies, expression grim. They shouldn't have found me. Voss knelt, searching the Corthan's armor. His fingers brushed against something cold, an embedded transponder. They hadn't just been tracking Dorn. They were waiting for me, Voss murmured. Kane frowned. Meaning? Dorn swore under his breath. Meaning they knew you'd come looking. A new kind of tension settled between them. If the Corthans had anticipated this, then Project Reclamation wasn't just a distant threat. It was already in motion. Voss straightened. We need to move. Dorn grabbed a bag from the wreckage, slinging it over his shoulder. I know someone who can break the encryption on that drive. But it won't be easy. Voss nodded. Mara? Kane groaned. I hate dealing with her. She's our best shot. Dorn glanced at the bodies one last time before stepping out into the corridor. Then we better make it fast. Because this... He gestured to the destruction around them. This was just a warning. No one disagreed. The war was waiting. The rendezvous point was a derelict mining station orbiting a dead moon. The Erebus slipped into the docking bay unnoticed, its engines humming as they powered down. Voss stood at the viewport, watching the distant stars flicker against the void, his mind turning over the pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit. The Corthans had expected them. That meant someone had been watching, waiting. The war hadn't just been simmering beneath the surface. It had already begun. Kane locked down the ship while Dorn checked his weapons, but neither spoke. They didn't need to. The silence between them wasn't the kind that needed filling. It was the kind that came with years of knowing exactly how bad things could get. They moved quickly through the corridors, boots echoing in the hollow shell of the station. The place had been abandoned for years, stripped of anything valuable, left to drift as a forgotten relic of a time when war had been about resources instead of survival. Now it served as a meeting ground for people who existed in the spaces between laws. Mara Yelton was waiting in a makeshift command center, feet propped on a rusted console, chewing on something that smelled like burnt caffeine. She looked up as they entered, her expression flickering between amusement and curiosity. Well, she drawled. Look what the war dragged back. Voss didn't waste time. He tossed the encrypted drive onto the console. I need it cracked. Mara raised an eyebrow, but didn't question it. She scooped up the drive, spun her chair toward a battered terminal, and plugged it in. Screens flickered to life, code streaming in a cascade of symbols that meant nothing to anyone except her. Kane crossed her arms, watching the process. Can you do it? Mara snorted. Please. Give me 10 minutes. She got to work, fingers dancing across the interface, her eyes scanning for weaknesses in the encryption. The room filled with the quiet hum of processing cycles, the occasional tap of keys. Voss paced. Dorn checked his rifle. Kane pretended not to be nervous. Then, Mara cursed. Voss was at her side in an instant. What? She leaned back, rubbing a hand across her face. This encryption? Military grade. Not ours. Corthan? She gestured at the screen, where fragments of decrypted data were appearing. This isn't just battle plans or troop movements. It's blueprints. Dorn frowned. Blueprints for what? Mara sighed. You're not going to like the answer. She typed a command, and a holographic projection flared to life. It was a station, massive, sprawling, with defensive structures unlike anything they had ever seen. But at its core, something pulsed, something alive with energy signatures that shouldn't exist. Kane took a step closer. Is that? A planetary disruptor, Mara confirmed. They're building a weapon capable of wiping out entire colonies in a single strike. Silence. Dorn exhaled, running a hand through his hair. This isn't a war. This is genocide. Voss stared at the projection, his jaw tightening. He had fought wars before. He had seen what the Corthans were capable of. But this was different. This was annihilation. Mara tapped another command, shifting the projection to highlight a series of coordinates. This station? It's still under construction. It's not fully operational yet, which means you might have a shot at stopping it. Voss narrowed his eyes. Might? Mara smirked. I said I could break codes, not perform miracles. Kane shook her head. We don't even know where to start. Dorn leaned over the console, studying the layout. Here, he said, pointing to a location near the station's central reactor. This is their vulnerability. If we can get in, plant charges, we can cripple the structure before it ever goes online. Mara scoffed. And then what? Hope the Corthans don't hunt you down and rip you apart for it. Voss met her gaze, his voice steady. We end this before it begins. She held his stare for a long moment, then sighed, pushing back from the console. You're all insane. Kane gave a tight smile. We know. Mara sighed again, but she was already pulling up schematics, mapping out possible infiltration points. I can get you in, she muttered. But once you're there, you're on your own. Voss nodded. That was always the way of things. Outside, the void stretched endlessly, silent and waiting. The war wasn't coming. It was already here. The Erebus cut through the void at full burn, the remnants of the Corthan station still glowing in the distance, a dying ember swallowed by the endless dark. The shockwave had sent tremors through the ship, rattling its already overworked systems. Warning lights flickered across the console, but the engines held. For now, survival was the only priority. Voss kept his grip firm on the controls, his breathing slow, measured. His mind was already calculating their next move, searching for an exit strategy that wouldn't lead them straight into another death trap. Kane sat beside him, running diagnostics, her lips pressed into a thin line. We won't make it far if we push the drive too hard, she murmured. It needs at least an hour to cycle. Dorn leaned against the bulkhead, still catching his breath, his rifle resting across his lap. His armor was scorched, a deep gash along his shoulder where an elite's blade had nearly found its mark. He ignored it. They'll come looking, he said. We hit them hard. They won't let it stand. They won't get the chance, Voss replied. We disappear. Go dark. Kane exhaled sharply, shaking her head. You really think that's an option? After what we just did? The weight of her words settled between them. This wasn't just another mission. They hadn't simply disrupted a supply chain or sabotaged a weapons cache. They had crippled a war machine before it could awaken. And the Corthans would never forget. Mara's voice crackled over the comm. I hope you're all still breathing. Barely, Kane muttered. Voss keyed the transmission. The station's gone. The weapon with it. There was a pause. Then Mara exhaled, a sound that was equal parts relief and exhaustion. Then you just bought humanity time? Voss heard the unspoken truth. Not peace. Not victory. Just time ***. Dorn shifted, staring out at the wreckage behind them. They'll build another. Mara was quiet for a beat. Maybe, but not today. Voss let that settle. It was all they could ask for. The ship drifted in silence for a while, the hum of the engines the only sound. Kane finally leaned back in her seat, rubbing at her temple. We should have died back there. Dorn let out a dry chuckle. Should have died a long time ago. Voss glanced at them both. But we didn't. They hadn't survived out of luck. They had survived because war was in their blood, because they had refused to stop fighting even when the battle had supposedly ended. And now, the war that never truly stopped had been forced into the open. The Corthans would retaliate. More would come. But so would they. Voss reached forward, switching their heading. A new course. A new fight. They weren't running. They were preparing for the next strike.